Jason, oh my God, that's where you work?
It's where I work. Though normally I'm not sitting in the middle of the vineyard to work, but I figured for our conversation that'd be probably appropriate.
That's unbelievable. I'm in what I refer to as the bunker. I'm staying with friends in Connecticut in their downstairs bedroom, the guest room. Going back to New York. Very simple white wall behind me. Let's just get right into it because I have so many questions for you. Would you basically tell me who you are, what your job is, and then how you got into it? Some people are born into a wine family, some people and then leave and come back. Some people figure it out along the way, and some people fall into it and are amazing. So I'd like to hear your story first of all.
Yeah, so I am definitely in the born into a wine family class of that. My dad was Robert Haas. He founded the importer Vineyard Brands. And he himself was part of an older wine family. His great uncle was Morris Lehman, who founded M. Lehman, which then merged with Sherry Wine and Spirits and became Sherry Lehman. So he got his start working for his grandfather, and being sent to France to find a new wine buyer for what was then M. Lehman, and ended up after, as far as I can tell, like 24 hours, deciding there was no way he was letting somebody else do that job. And became the wine buyer for M. Lehman. And eventually, when my grandfather was getting ready to retire, rather than go back and work retail, my dad decided that he was going to take all the contacts that he'd made and turn them into an importing business, which is what Vineyard Brands was. So I grew up surrounded by wine people and wine families and wine, and always figured that I would end up in the wine business somewhere. But Tablas Creek, where I am now, didn't exist when I was a kid. It was really my dad's retirement project. Started in the late 80s when I was already in high school. And I also didn't want to go straight into a family business right out of school because I didn't feel like I would bring enough. So I ended up working in tech. I got a master's degree in archaeology. I taught for a while. I ended up managing a tech company that taught web programming languages based in DC for 4 years. And moved out here in 2002 at the point at which Tablas Creek had grown from being a project into being a business that needed someone to run it on a day-to-day basis. So I've been out here for 18 years. I'm the general manager out here as well as one of the partners. And my job is to make sure that all of the great people we have in charge of our different pieces are talking to each other and listening to each other, making sure that we have good relationships with distributors and media and importers around the country, and then just generally making sure that we have a plan, have a strategy, and have something that we're all pushing towards.
It's a lot of hats, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
It's a pleasure.
So can you? I always like, because there's people on here who are wine lovers and then there's wine professionals, and so to kind of toe the line with both of those people, can you tell us basically about Paso Robles, what makes that special and unique, and then give us the history of Tablas Creek and the vision and what you guys do there?
Sure. Those are kind of intertwined. So the idea behind Tablas Creek was, this was always conceived of as a joint partnership, equally owned and run by my family and by the Perrin family from Chateau de Beaucastel in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, whose wines my dad represented as their importer for 3 decades. And they started talking about how much California reminded them of the south of France on sales trips that they would make together to California. And came away saying, why in this Mediterranean climate is nobody planting the grapes that we know and love from the Rhone? If you think of this is like the 70s and 80s, you think of what was being planted in California, it was a lot of Cabernet and Chardonnay and Merlot and Pinot Noir, not really Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Roussanne, Marsanne, Viognier. So the idea of doing a Rhone project somewhere in California came first. And it wasn't until we started looking for the right spot in the late 80s that Paso Robles entered the picture. And there were really 3 things that we were looking for that led us here. The first was the right kind of climate, which meant hot enough and sunny enough and a long enough growing season to ripen some of the latest ripening grapes in France. You think of grapes like Mourvèdre and Roussanne, which are our 2 most important grapes, and those ripen later than Cabernet. So you need a long growing season. But there are also earlier ripening grapes in the Rhone family, like Viognier and Syrah, that don't do well when it's hot all the time. So what we were looking for is a place with a long growing season, a lot of sun, but moderation somehow. So either by altitude or ocean influence that kept the nights cool.
Okay.
And Paso Robles has both of those. We're only one range of mountains separated from the Pacific. So where I'm sitting here, we're about 11 miles from the Pacific Ocean, but there's a range of mountains in between that blocks the direct ocean influence. So it's not like the Santa Maria Valley or the Petaluma Gap where there's fog coming through every afternoon. But there's this huge reservoir of cold air that's 12 miles away. So every time the sun goes down, the heat radiates off, it's replaced by this cold air that's coming in off the coast. So that's the first thing we were looking for is climate. The second thing was enough rainfall to farm without having to irrigate. Because we felt that dry farming was going to be one of the key pieces of being able to show off the terroir of the place that we chose. And that's hard to do if you're forced to irrigate, because it keeps roots in the topsoil, in the surface zone, as opposed to forcing them down deep. And a lot of the places that are warm enough to ripen Rhone varieties in California are too dry to dry farm, because you've got to be fairly far south or inland in order to have enough heat. But Paso, in these foothills of the Santa Lucia mountain range where we are, we get the rain that comes off the Pacific, the storms that come off the Pacific every winter, and then there's a rain shadow once you go further inland. So we get, on average, about 28 inches of rain a year. The town of Paso, which is only another 10 miles inland from us, gets about half that. So you have to be really in those foothills and at some altitude to have enough rain to dry farm, but you can do it. And then the third thing that we were looking for was limestone soil. So I'm going to flip the camera around and show. So I'm right outside one of the enclosures that we have for our animals. So the sheep have decided to come over and say hello. They missed their cue. They're not supposed to come on stage for another few minutes. But you can see behind them this dry-laid rock limestone wall that we used to help build this paddock. And that's all just limestone bits that we pulled out of the vineyard. And that soil is the same soil as there is in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It's common in a lot of the great wine regions in Europe, but it's rare in California. So it's one of the things that sets the Central Coast apart from, say, Napa or Sonoma or the Sierra foothills or other areas that have a climate that you could do Rhone varieties in.
That's fascinating, and you really explained it. You must have done this before. You explained it really, really well. So then, to get even a little bit more nerdy, how do you, and it sounds like your dad did this, but how do you then decide, okay, here's this plot of land that we have. How do you decide where you put the Mourvèdre and where you put the Roussanne?
So actually, we had a challenge before that, which was, how do we find the vines that we know we want to plant? Because it wasn't like we could just go to our neighbors and be like, hey, give me a cutting of your best Mourvèdre vines. Right. Several of the varieties that we knew we wanted to work with didn't exist in California. And there were some real suspicions about the provenance and the quality of all of them. So we ended up deciding, rather than just working with what was here, that we would bring in new cuttings of all the principal varieties from Beaucastel. And that requires waiting for a 3-year USDA quarantine and then building a grapevine nursery, which propagates the 6 cuttings you're allowed to bring in through the quarantine program into enough to start planting your vineyard. So we imported new cuttings of Mourvèdre, Grenache, Syrah, and Cunoise on reds, and then Roussanne, Marsanne, Viognier, Grenache Blanc, and Picpoul Blanc for whites. This is funny. Our alpaca just came to say hello. I'm going to flip the camera around so you can see just how close he is.
Wow, and they clearly know you and love you.
They are used to people and figuring that when people come by, something interesting sometimes happens. That's yeah. He's like it's distracting because his face is right behind the phone.
So funny.
So we brought in cuttings of all of the principal Rhone varieties, and then worked with the parents to figure out what to plant where. So we have the advantage that we're working with a family that's 5 generations into growing Rhone grapes and having them say, yeah, south-facing slope up high, that's going to be good for Mourvèdre. East-facing slope where it's cooler, probably Syrah. That low area, which looks like it's going to be prone to frost, Broussard will go there because it sprouts late. So we did a first kind of a first plan, laid out the whole vineyard and planted most of it pretty fast. We planted most of the vineyard between 95 and 2000. And we got it mostly right. There have been a few things that we realized we got wrong and have had to graft over one thing to something else. But by and large, we picked a site that's pretty hilly, so it's got a lot of different exposures, which is great because that allows us to match up what is best for each of this pretty diverse family of grapes to a spot that's going to be good for it.
Nadine Brown just said there would be no Rhone Rangers without Tablas Creek and that nursery.
Hi, Nadine. Miss you.
It's so funny that Nadine's on here because years ago I wrote an article about American wine, and she's always a champion of American wine. It helped me out so many years ago, so it's like full circle. So can you tell me about the evolution of farming practices there, how it started, how it is now, and then we can start to talk about the reason we're here, biodiversity. When I started here, the more I did this, it seemed everybody that was real cutting edge and real forward thinking was really talking about biodiversity. So my first encounter with real serious subject was Mimi Castile on Levi Dalton's podcast. And then I talked to some people in France, and it just kind of blows me away. It's like past biodynamic, it's like really thinking about the next generation. And rather than even growing wine is forward, people now it's growing soil. And so I story how you got there, and then we'll long conversation about what you.
The alpaca just stuck its nose through and tried to nibble on the phone. So if you see it wobble, that's why. It's the alpaca. So we inherited from Beaucastel a commitment to organic farming. They've been farming organically all the way back since the early 1960s. And we felt like, again, a little bit like dry farming, that was kind of a baseline for us making wines with a sense of place. And the more we got into it, so we've been organic since we started. We got our organic certification back in 2003. But the more we dove into it, the more convinced we became that really for our purposes, biodynamics was probably closer to what we wanted than organics. Because if you can think of organics as being trying to find non-chemical ways of doing your basic weed control and pest control and fertilization, biodynamics is a little more holistic look in trying to build an ecosystem so that you don't need to intervene chemically or non-chemically because the soils are healthy, there's enough diversity in your ecosystem that you don't need to put organic fertilizer on your vineyard because you've planted a cover crop that produces nitrogen in the soil, and therefore you don't need to fertilize at all. So if I think it's useful thinking of organics as being a list of things you can't do,
right?
And biodynamics being kind of a more holistic look at the things that you should do to avoid having to intervene at all.
Yeah. Is kind of the way we're learning now that like there really aren't any weeds. Like I've heard in Dan Barber's book, he's like, if the soil needs something, the weed will grow. And we're eating purslane now, and it's sorry, but continue. I cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that point a little bit. We've certainly got some plants that we think are pretty noxious. That's the alpaca like itching his ear against the post. There's some plants that we would rather not have around the vineyard, but there are better ways than poisoning those plants to get rid of them. You basically plant other things that are going to displace them, that are helpful in one way or another. So we do plant cover crops in different parts of the vineyard, but there's also areas that we leave to reseed naturally. There's areas that we till. There's areas that we leave untilled. Again, you get different things out of each of those practices, and the whole goal is that you're creating an ecosystem, not a monoculture. So when you think, I think one of the ways that makes it easy for people to understand is that if you have a monoculture, say you have a vineyard, you have grapes, and you've basically done what you can to get rid of anything that might compete with the grapes. Mm-hmm. So what you have there is a big draw on the nutrients that grapes need, nothing really to put that back in the soil, and an attractive nuisance for anything that might prey on grapes, and really no habitat for the things that might control the things that would prey on grapes. So what you're doing by building biodiversity in is you're essentially building resilience into your into your farm unit, so that you already have, you live with a small number of the pests you don't want, so that you have food for the things that eat the pests that you don't want. You leave growth in your vineyard, you leave cover crops in your vineyard, again, partially because it provides habitat, but because each of those different species that you have in your vineyard is going to attract different microorganisms. It's going to pull different nutrients out of the soil, and then as it decomposes and decays back in the soil, add different things back in. So you're essentially getting rid of the fragility that you might find in a monoculture and replacing it with a polyculture.
Do you find that because you're clearly letting some land that you could put vines in grow some alpacas and trees that cost money? You could make more money that if you planted vines there. Do you, as a business proposal, how do you say that's fine to do?
So there's a couple of pieces of that calculation. I mean, the animal herd that we now have a flock of about 250 sheep, a handful of alpacas, a guard donkey to help keep them safe from predators, and then a couple of big Spanish mastiffs to help guard the flock from mountain lions. And what we do is that was sort of the last piece of the biodiversity that we felt comfortable building back in, because it's easy enough to do things like planting a cover crop or interplanting fruit trees among your vines, and we've done that for a long time. But animals add a ton to any ecosystem, and no ecosystem is really complete without them. But at the same time, you can't just have your sheep roaming in the vineyard at all times of year freely. They will happily eat the growth off the vines. They'll happily eat the fruit. So what we've had to do is come up with a system where we have a shepherd on staff. He does other things, but his title is shepherd. And he has designed a plan where we move the animals through different blocks of the vineyard every winter. So they cycle through, they eat the cover crops down, they fertilize with their manure, then they leave, and they leave every 24 to 48 hours. So they're not overgrazing anything. All of that gets mixed back into the soil, and then that cover crop regrows, and a month or 6 weeks later, the animals will return back to that block, and we keep them through. So we can get them through all of the vineyard 4 times every winter while the vineyard is dormant. And then in the summer, we have areas that we've left unplanted that we can move the sheep to. And we also have the oak forest understory where they can browse and graze in the summer, and that reduces our fire risk, which is a big consideration in California. So yes, there are some areas of the vineyard that we could plant that we haven't yet planted, which right now are convenient to put the flock in the summer. But there's always going to be 100+ acres that are unplanted on our 250 acre property for the flock to be in the summer and fall when they can't be safely in the vineyard.
So I hope I'm not asking something out of turn, but very specifically, like, what does the alpaca do? Does it eat a certain time that you want him to eat the grass, or like I know they all benefit somehow to make the next animal, but just name a couple of the animals and what benefit they give, because I can't figure that out on my own.
So essentially, alpacas are just like big sheep. They eat basically the same thing that a sheep will eat, though they can reach higher, which is useful when they're in the forest. Okay. But we ended up with alpacas not because we specifically chose them for the vineyard, but because we had a neighbor who's like, I've got a dozen alpacas that I'm getting rid of. You want them? And we figured, what the heck, we'll try. And they're more watchful than sheep are. So what they'll do is in addition to the grazing that they do, they keep an eye out for predators, because they've got long necks and they're up high. And whenever they see something that they think is a threat, they make these little like yipping barks, and all of the sheep look around, and then everybody runs to the opposite end of the enclosure, and the dogs jump up. And so they're grazers, but they're also a little bit of an early warning signal.
Okay. And then
but the main workers in this flock are the sheep. I mean, they're the ones that they graze. They return 80% of the biomass of what they graze to the soil in the form of their manure. They only use 20% to build body mass. Mm-hmm. Their natural instinct is to climb. So what they'll do, there's the just erosion tends to bring topsoil from the tops of hills down to the bottom. So sheep do the opposite. They graze where the grass is thickest, and then they shelter up at tops of hills. So they help cycle the nutrients back up to places that are generally lower, thinner soils and need the nutrients more. They reproduce fairly reliably. So we'll typically get anywhere between 1 and 1.5 lambs per sheep that we have in the flock each year. So that allows us to build the flock when we want to build the flock, but we also now supply about 30 local restaurants with lamb every year.
Oh, wow.
So you have that extra piece that's added a little bit to the business, and it certainly adds to the kind of visibility and profile of Tablas Creek in a cool way.
Yeah. And then different animals, like the manure that they find, there's different like acidities to different manure, and all of that gets in the soil and adds to the richness of the soil.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's a really critical thing. We don't have enough alpacas, and we only have one donkey. I think it's basically the sheep that are doing most of the work. The larger animals are more acting as guardians of the smaller animals, and yeah, I mean, the alpacas and the donkeys. The donkey are both a little bit relics of an earlier era where we thought that they would be enough to protect the flock from mountain lions.
Oh.
It turned out that once mountain lions had gotten a taste for lamb, yeah, they'd leave the donkeys and the alpaca alone, but they weren't going to get scared off by them. So we got the mastiffs now 2.5 years ago, and the alpacas and the donkey are a little bit superfluous at this point, but at the same time, they act like big sheep and graze and move around with the rest of the sheep, and they don't seem to cause any problems.
So what benefit do the fruit trees give that you mentioned earlier?
So they attract different insects, different bees. Generally, grapevines don't particularly attract bees. That's not how they're pollinated. They're pollinated by wind. But a lot of the other things in the cover crop do attract bees. So we have our own couple of beehives of wild swarms that we've captured, and the fruit trees help support those. But again, each different species that you have is going to change the microorganisms in the soil a little bit. We haven't tried to pull out exactly what that quince tree adds that the cherry doesn't, that the peach doesn't, that the apricot doesn't, but figure that with the 300 or so fruit trees that we have scattered around the vineyard, the cumulative impact is going to be enough to make it worth doing.
And then do you, you said someone asked about who buys your land, you're comfortable saying that, but does someone go and, like, when you plant fava beans somewhere, does someone go and harvest the beans, and does someone harvest those apricots?
Someone harvests the fruit for sure. And then we share it out among our vineyard crew and our staff, which is fun. There'll be like a couple of weeks ago, we just had this giant bin of plums that showed up in the middle of the office because the plum trees were all ripe. So yeah, they get shared out. Most of the things that are the kind of ground annual things that grow in the cover crop, those don't get harvested. We grow sweet peas as part of the cover crop because it's a legume and it puts nitrogen back in the soil, but nobody's harvesting the peas. And they're just going back into the soil.
Do you plow in the cover crop, and how often do you do that? Or
so it depends. Typically what we try to do is we try to alternate years or alternate rows, and sometimes both, where we're not tilling every row every year. We want to leave things there that will go to seed and help seed the next year's cover crops. But at the same time, if you don't ever till it, you run into a number of other issues, including bigger issues with gophers. So what we'll often do is we'll either spade or disc every other year. So once in the spring, as we get to the point where we're trying to knock these cover crops that might be 5-6 feet high at that point, we want to knock those down so that we can get good drainage of air in the spring so we don't create frost problems for ourselves. We also want to make sure that we're not creating warrens for ground squirrels and gophers. So things are either disked under or they're mowed. typically in April or May. And then because of the climate here, where it rains between November and April and then does not rain in the summer or fall, they don't really grow back, which is a luxury that we have in California.
And so there's a spreadsheet somewhere that says this plot every other, like the rows. It's like,
Yep.
so as a consumer, like I imagine biodiversity makes the vineyard healthier, so it's going to survive drought and hail and frost, whatever, a little bit better. But as a consumer drinking this glass of wine, why am I benefited, or why does this wine taste better, or maybe it's more affordable to do that?
That's a very squishy question. It's hard to answer. I'll answer it in two ways. Neither of them are particularly satisfactory, but it's what I got. So the biggest thing that we think, the biggest change that we've seen since moving to farming biodynamically versus farming organically, and we don't have a comparison to conventional modern chemical farming because we never did that, but the vines are healthier and live longer because you're reducing the amount of stress that they're under, because you're increasing the carbon content and the water holding capacity of the soil, so they feel heat spikes less. You can tell that the vines are under less stress just by looking at them, and also if you want to measure them chemically, do pressure bombs on the leaves or whatever. There's different ways of measuring this, but the vines are under less stress, so they live longer. So you don't have to replant your vineyard after 25 or 30 years. You have the benefit of 30, 40, 50-year-old grapevines, and that's a long-term benefit. But I think that's one of the ways that it really plays out in wine quality. The other is obviously more subjective, but the way that we started farming biodynamically is we decided to take a 20-acre slice of the vineyard that basically went from high to low across a bunch of different blocks and a bunch of different varieties, and farm that fully biodynamically starting in 2010. And so we did that in 2010, not expecting much other than hoping to see lower stress on the vines and more vine health. But then when we started our blending trials that we do as the first part of our kind of putting the wines together every spring, we taste all of the different lots that we harvest blind in flights. And the lots that came from that biodynamic slice were all towards the top of our rankings. Wow. We didn't know where they were from. We're tasting them blind. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. The same thing happened in 2011, which was a very different sort of year than 2010. At which point we were like, this is probably not a coincidence. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but we really like the wines that are coming from those blocks. Let's expand that. So we basically expanded that biodynamic slice to 40 acres the next year and gradually built that up until we were farming the whole vineyard biodynamically in 2016.
Wow.
And again, this is subjective, but I feel like this run of vintages that we've been on since 2016, 17, 18, 19, is the best string of vintages we've ever had at Tablas Creek. So is some of that vine age? I'm sure. Is some of that us learning a little bit every year? I'm sure. Is some of that farming biodynamically and the biodiversity that goes into that? I think it is.
Yeah. There's something, I think, rewarding to it.
Yeah. I mean, I know that we've seen a difference in the way that even like our vineyard crew interacts with the vineyard and with the different blocks since we started farming biodynamically, since we got the animals in there. They're coming out and bringing their kids to see what they're doing in the vineyard. And I feel like that level of attention has got to be a good thing.
That's really lovely. Wow. Well, we're at a half hour and I asked all my questions, but do you have anything that I missed or that you want to tell people?
I don't think so, except that if this is stuff that people are fascinated by, we spend a fair amount of time talking about it on the blog that we write. So if people want to dive in and take a look at the Tablas Creek blog, that might be something that's of interest. They can find that off of the Tablas Creek website or just do a search for it. And that this is sort of a weird time, but we love getting people out into the vineyard, taking people on tours, showing people what we're doing, not just in the wine and the winery, but in the the farming and the vineyard and the grapevine nursery that we still have here on site. So we'll take people out who come to visit and show them how you graft a grapevine, what it looks like to have what a rootstock field looks like, what's the difference between rootstock and vinifera, how grapevines go through quarantine, all of these different pieces. Like the whole thing happens here, from nursery to vineyard to winery to tasting room. So it's we try to share as much of that as we can in as many ways as we can.
That's really awesome. Do you I asked, I forgot that do you sell direct? Has that kind of buffered the quarantine a little bit in sales?
Yeah, we do. We sell about we're split about half and half. Half of what we make we sell direct, either out of our tasting room or over by phone or internet or out to one of our wine clubs, and about half through the Vineyard Brands network of distributors around the country. So during the stay-at-home periods when restaurants had to close and when our tasting room had to close, we were fortunate and gratified that the internet and phone orders rose to not totally make up the difference, but to make up a bigger piece of the difference than I ever would have thought possible. Yeah. So yeah, it is a big piece of what we do.
That's great. It's the model I think that everybody else is looking at, particularly France, because they don't do that so much, and they're all getting websites now and encouraging people to come direct. So, well, Jason, you've been delightful from the get-go of being so willing to help me out and come and explain things to me. So thank you so much. It's really
totally my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
I hope to see you soon. I want to come out and see that nursery.
It's a deal.
All right, you take care, man. Thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.